In this lecture, I plan to deal with the kings and princes of Western Europe and, in a wider fashion, look at the revival and development of European political institutions that made the Crusades possible. The economic and social changes I've discussed were at a very basic level, dealing with the manner and changes in agriculture, and in some ways, political life also paralleled this. You were dealing with a very localized political organization in early medieval Europe, and by the time of the Crusades in 1095, when the First Crusade is preached, Europe has made some remarkable strides in political organization. Even so, it was not the kings of Europe that responded to the call of Urban II. None of the three great kings actually assumed the cross. These would be William Rufus, King of England, Philip I of France, and the then Holy Roman Emperor and King of Germany, Henry IV. Instead, we shall see that it is the nobles, especially the nobles of France and of the eastern regions of France today that were then part of the Holy Roman Empire, that responded to the call. And there's good reasons for this. So in order to understand the political rebirth of European institutions and to understand who responded to the call, I think it's best to look at what Latin Christendom was like in the year 800, the time the Emperor Charlemagne was crowned. What were the institutions of the Carolingian Empire, the political and administrative institutions, and then see how these institutions evolve into the feudal kingdoms seen in 1095, particularly England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, which encompassed not only what is now Germany, but Switzerland, the Low Countries, northern and central Italy. It was a much larger entity than just current Germany. Well, in 800 AD, Christendom was really quite small. The Frankish king Charlemagne had united the various Christian lands of Western Europe, and essentially what he ruled would be the heartland of the original European community. That is France, the Low Countries, what was once West Germany before the end of the Cold War, northern and central Italy, parts of Switzerland and Austria. This was the core of his kingdom. It was acquired through inheritance and conquest. This is the Carolingian Empire. In addition, in Western Europe, that is, kingdoms that would have recognized the authority of the Pope in Rome and would have considered themselves part of Latin Christendom, you had a small kingdom in northwestern Spain, the Kingdom of Asturias, precariously holding on to its independence from the far more powerful Muslim state that was based at Cordova. And then there were a series of petty kingdoms and chiefdoms in Ireland and Scotland, Wales and England. That is, the British Isles were also part of this Latin Christendom. By the time of 1095, the borders of Latin Christendom had expanded considerably, and we now have three great monarchies, England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Well, the Franks, the Germanic tribe who entered the Roman world in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, gave their name to France, were the most important newcomers into the Roman Empire for the future of Western European civilization. The Franks had taken over what was probably one of the most important provinces of the Roman world, Gaul. The dynasty that came to rule there were known as the Merovingians. Their most famous king was Clovis, from which we get the name Louis, actually, is derived from Clovis, who converted to Catholic Christianity, brought the Franks respectability in the eyes of the papacy. And he and his successors, the Merovingian kings, ruled until this dynasty was finally deposed in 751. By their own ministers, the so-called Carolingians. The Merovingian kings based their rule on hereditary right. I think they were descended from a sea dragon or something who was the eponymous ancestor of this crowd. They also had a lot of sacral power and associations. There were ancient pagan associations where they were carried around in carts drawn by goats. In any case, this was an ancient Germanic kingship that now came to rule over a former portion of the Roman world. And the Merovingian kings adapted Roman institutions to their own use and handed out territories to their counts, or comes in Latin, that was an old Roman military term, who began to administer these regions at a local level. And the history of Merovingian kingship is one of increasing decentralization from the time of Clovis running down until the final abolition of that monarchy. By the middle of the 7th century A.D., usually associated with the reign of Dagobert II, the Merovingian kings had ceased to exercise effective authority outside of their immediate area. Well, the Merovingian kings are often looked upon as essentially one of a number of Germanic kingdoms. You have them in Italy and Spain. The Spanish one, the Visigoths, is brought down by the Arabs. The one in Italy, the Ostrogoths, are brought down by the Byzantines, that essentially succeeded to late Roman institutions. The really first precocious, even political order, synthesis, was forged by the Carolingian monarchs. And the Carolingians had originally started out as what are known as the major domo, which means nothing more than the greater man of the household, the top honcho in the royal household of the Merovingian kings, and a succession of extremely able major domos, starting with Charles Martel, who defeated an Arabic attack from Spain in 732, his son Pepin the Short, consolidated power in Gaul, which is far more than France, includes sections of eastern Germany and the Low Countries. And the most notable achievement was that Pepin the Short also claimed the kingship as a result of the right of victories. And this was legitimized by securing a papal coronation. Now, there are a number of reasons why Pope Stephen II agreed to this. One, he arranged an alliance with the Frankish king to invade Italy and take out the Lombards, who were a danger to papal authority in central Italy. And in return, Pepin gave the papacy the so-called donation of Pepin, that was the lands of central Italy that became ultimately the Papal States. In the case of Pepin, he needed the legitimacy. He needed to justify the usurpation of a hereditary kingship, and what better way than to get the sanction of the Pope, who was without question the most impressive figure in Western Europe at the time. There were other reasons involving Byzantine religious and political confusion we need not go into. Well, Pepin's son, Charlemagne, proved to be the man who essentially recreated an imperial order in Western Europe for the first time in over 3 centuries. He built the great Carolingian Empire. He campaigned tirelessly. He brought regions of Germany under control, notably northwestern Germany, Saxony, which was still pagan, campaigned across the Elbe into the lands of the Slavic peoples, moved into Italy, subdued the Lombards, and incorporated northern and central Italy into his empire. He crossed the Pyrenees to drive back the Arab raiders and advance the frontier of his empire to the upper reaches of the Ebro, which is the northernmost river of Spain, and therefore got into contact with that kingdom of Asturias. Now, Charlemagne's important for a variety of reasons, not only because of the territorial extent of his empire, but also the ambitions of what this empire was supposed to represent. On Christmas Day 800, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, or more accurately, Emperor of the Romans. This was another papal coronation, but it put Charlemagne in a whole new level. It didn't magically change Carolingian institutions, which still remain primarily local, but it certainly marked out Charlemagne and his heirs as successor to a Christian Roman vision of empire. And that's an important point to stress, because that vision will persist through the Middle Ages. And it had a number of important implications. For one, Charlemagne insisted on hereditary succession. This was by no means clear in the early Middle Ages, and it still is being debated at the time of the Crusades, whether monarchs were hereditary or elective, going back to an old Germanic principle. In addition, Charlemagne intended and succeeded in transmitting his domains to his son, Louis the Pious, a rather unfortunate name. Any Carolingian monarch named the Pious is usually quite weak. He's generally favored by monastic chroniclers, but otherwise is inept. Louis the Pious succeeded as the next emperor, and this too was an issue that was raised, because in medieval kingdoms very often territory was partitioned. It was treated as private property. It was parceled out. This was the history of Merovingian kingship. A king would come to power. He would divide the domains among 3 or 4 sons. They would fight, reassemble the domains. Once again, it would be divided. And through the whole Middle Ages, we'll see this played out even in Outremer, in the regions that the Crusaders will take, that there was always this tension: is the monarchy actually private property that can be broken up among the heirs, or is it a single unit? Is there a crown, an abstract monarchy, the crown, that goes to a designated heir apparent, and in his absence, an heir presumptive? Charlemagne also linked the fortunes of this state with the papacy and the Christian justifications of a just royal monarchy. Now, Louis's sons fought for partition. They fought for the older tradition, and ultimately this is what happened to Charlemagne's empire. His grandsons divided it in 843 at the official division is at the Treaty of Verdun, where a Western Frankish kingdom emerges, which corresponds more or less to France. An Eastern Frankish kingdom emerged, which is essentially Western Germany, parts of Switzerland and Austria, and then a middle kingdom known as Lotharingia, which went to the oldest son, Lothar, which survives today in the name of Lorraine. And this was a domain that stretched from the Low Countries up the Rhine, through the Alps, into central and northern Italy. Now, that kingdom is often looked upon as really quite ludicrous by many, but this partition actually made a certain amount of sense. And that gets us into the question of Carolingian institutions and how we evolve into the feudal monarchies. For one, the 3 kingdoms more or less corresponded in size and wealth, had more or less corresponding in size and wealth, lands known as the fisc, that is, royal domains. Domains that you could hand out to vassals, men who would provide military service. So all 3 kings in this partition, Charles the Bald in France, Louis the German in Germany, and Lothar in the Central Kingdom, more or less had the same amount of royal property. Second, these borders took into consideration, as best as we can determine, other than pre-existing lines among various vassals. You didn't just arbitrarily carve out the domains of a vassal, parceling out one to here, one king, one to the other, so you wouldn't have complicated dual allegiance. Finally, the oldest son, Lothar, got the imperial title. That is, Holy Roman Emperor, which had to be done by a coronation in Rome, and that meant he got the 2 capitals. That would be Aachen, now in Germany, and Rome, the 2 which were regarded then as the 2 imperial centers. Now, that division into 3 kingdoms is an important point to stress because it is the premise behind all political developments in Western Europe thereafter, at least on the continent. Now, there's a separate situation that will go on in England and Spain. In addition to these political changes, the Carolingian world also saw the beginnings of an extremely important evolution on the local level, which would allow for the reconstruction of political stability in Western Europe. And that is the shift over to something known as the fief, the feudum, in medieval Latin texts. And this was a means of rewarding supporters. And you have to remember from the previous lecture that coined money is in rather short supply, even in the Carolingian period, and that the kings just don't have the revenues to maintain a bureaucracy and an army, that you shifted over to these fiefs, which were lands granted in return for military service. Now, this fused a variety of traditions. One was dependent land tenure that you can find in Roman laws. Another was a tradition of warrior bands putting themselves at the disposal of a lord, rendering what later became known as homage, which was a religious rite in which a vassal put himself under the suzerainty of a lord. These were then sanctified in a Christian tradition, and the Carolingian world sees a steady shift to this type of organization. And particularly, the military service was connected with the equipping of heavily armed cavalry, the so-called knights. There will be changes in military technology we'll discuss in a separate lecture. But the need to obtain fiefs, to hand out fiefs to vassals, who in turn would hand out fiefs to other vassals, lesser vassals, all the way down the line, and each owing military service in turn up to their final lord, was the basis for the political organization of medieval Europe. Some historians are really hesitant to speak of a term feudalism. It's actually a late term. It was, I think, coined in the 18th century. But nonetheless, the term does describe an arrangement that came to characterize the heartland of the Carolingian Empire. With the death of Louis the Pious and the division of the empire in 843, the Carolingian Empire lapsed into a period of wars, civil wars. There were attacks by Vikings on the shores of northern Europe, invasions of Hungarians in the east, Arab raiders based in Spain plunged deep into France. And so running from the 840s up until the early 10th century, say even almost the 950s, 940s, Western Europe was very much under siege. And the Carolingian world lost its cohesion, and the political institutions at the top, the kingship and the emperorship, lost control to the vassals at the local level. And that was pretty much characterized across Western Europe at different levels. That is, in France, what became Germany, what became Italy, vassals asserted themselves because they were on the spot. They would handle the invader. They ultimately were the people who had the military force. Now, I mentioned that there were two other areas that were outside the Carolingian area and not necessarily influenced. One was England, which had been settled by Anglo-Saxons in the early Middle Ages, Germanic peoples coming across the North Sea. And there you had a different pattern. That monarchy that emerged in the 8th and 9th centuries, essentially contemporary with the Carolingian kings, that monarchy did not evolve the institutions that led to feudalism. Far from it, the feudal structure was brought to England by virtue of the Norman conquest in 1066, or more accurately, the feudal arrangements. The English monarchy took a different turn. It, too, was very regional and local in its basis, but it built upon local institutions that were known as the county level, the shire level. The counties and shires of England go back to the 9th century, and particularly to the efforts of King Alfred the Great, who in 871 and 899 unified southeastern England, warded off the Viking attacks, and whose descendants eventually united all of England under the House of Wessex, centered in Winchester, and devised a remarkable monarchy which drew upon the local resources and institutions of the island. In Spain, the situation was far more precarious, and we'll discuss Spain in another connection. But there, in this tiny kingdom of Asturias, in the 8th centuries and 9th centuries, essentially you had a series of Christian kings who were holding off a Muslim conquest and had come very quickly to depend on support from their Christian allies north of the Pyrenees. Well, this is the situation in Carolingian and immediate post-Carolingian Europe. The breakdown of this ambitious effort at imperial and royal authority on the continent as a result of civil wars, attacks by new invaders, whereas in England, in some ways, the Viking invasions actually galvanized the population to rally around a king and lead to the construction of a kingdom in England, the so-called Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which really is the kingdom of Wessex, which is in the southwest. Well, how's the situation by the time we get to the Crusades? Where have these kingdoms gone? Well, in 1095, out of this Carolingian order and confusion, there had emerged three great feudal monarchies. Let's take a look at the Carolingian heartland, France, first. In 1095, King Philip I was ruling over his traditional realm, which was around Paris, l'Île de la Cité, which was all that Paris was today. That would be where Notre Dame and Saint-Denis are. A very small town, and he ruled by right of hereditary succession, which is an important achievement on his part. I mentioned there was this constant dispute, is the kingship elective or hereditary? He, however, was not a Carolingian. He was descended from a fellow called Hugh Capet, who in 987 had been elected by the nobility of France when the Carolingian line had become defunct in the Western Kingdom. And what Hugh Capet and his successors were able to do, they were able to achieve two important breakthroughs is one, insist on hereditary succession and insist that that hereditary succession was to a single heir, and also held on to the royal title of king, which came by right of the crowning by the Archbishop of Rheims. And that was an important aspect of the French monarchy, because by 1095, when the First Crusade is preached, the Capetian kings of France were looked upon as the hereditary monarchs of the Kingdom of France. They were sanctified by the French Church, and having that sanctification meant that the French king could work through the clergy, especially the bishops and abbots, the senior prelates of the French Church, and affect aspects of their realm beyond just what their limited royal officials could do. On the other hand, the French kings were remarkably weak in comparison to their contemporaries in England and in the Holy Roman Empire. During the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th and 10th centuries, not only did the Carolingian line become extinct, but essentially the local vassals asserted their power. In the course of the Civil War, certain regions in France, what we would now today call France, the rulers there, either under the title of count or duke, which are old Roman military titles, essentially asserted their authority as independent agents, as independent rulers. These included Burgundy, Brittany, Aquitaine, Flanders, which is essentially now parts of Belgium and northeastern France, and in the south, Toulouse. In 911, another such feudal state was added in Normandy, just north of Paris, when the area was handed out to Rollo, or Roloff, a Norwegian Viking, who was granted the property in return for military service with an act of homage. There's a whole marvelous story told about it. The act of homage at this point was already a very well-known ritual. Rollo was asked to kiss the foot of his new lord, who was known as Charles the Simple. The Carolingians tended to name their kings after their vices rather than their virtues. And Rollo just looked at this notion as silly and told one of his Viking comrades, "You kiss the foot." And so the comrade simply picked the king up, the foot up, and tossed the king over on his back to kiss the foot. And everyone laughs, and it's symbolic of the weakness of the king and the power of Rollo and his descendants, who became Dukes of Normandy. That is, these Vikings intermarried with local population, adopted the French language, and became the Normans. As a result, by 1095, what had happened is that political authority in France had broken down to such a low level that it had to be rebuilt from the bottom up. And by 1095, there were a group of 6 leading feudal nobles, known as the Peers of France, who had more or less gotten their local lords and vassals, the Castellans, the men who handled castles, under their authority. They all owed liege homage to the King of France, the Capetian family ruling in Paris. And that meant they owed military service and other rights and duties. But what the King of France could actually do with these nobles on a day-to-day basis was extremely limited. He depended entirely on their goodwill, on marriage connections, and the like. So that the French monarchy in 1095 was, by our standards, extremely weak. France was not really governed from Paris. In fact, there was no France. There was a Kingdom of France in which there was neither political, cultural, or linguistic unity. Most of the Bretons spoke a Celtic language. Flanders spoke a Germanic language. Southern France spoke Provençal, which is its own Romance language. And they all owed a loyalty, personal loyalty, to the king. Well, the situation was somewhat different in England. In England, that peculiar monarchy emerged under the Anglo-Saxon kings, and then in 1066, there was an immediate and dramatic conquest by the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror. And the Battle of Hastings put a French vassal on the throne of England. William brought the institutions, the arrangements of feudal tenures in return for the military service, imposed it on England, confiscated estates, awarded them to his vassals. But unlike the French king, William and his heirs kept very close control over their vassals, so that England became one of the most effectively governed kingdoms in Western Europe. And the kings of England fell heirs to all of these traditional, especially legal and administrative institutions that went back to the Anglo-Saxon age, the most important of which is the common law. These they adapted to royal purpose, but they superimposed upon it the political and military arrangements of feudal Normandy. Even so, this does not mean that the Norman Kingdom of England was at all on the order of, say, the bureaucratic empire of Byzantium. William, as well as his dependents, had to base their rule on the goodwill of their vassals. They had to adhere to the traditions of homage and all that implied. Furthermore, the Norman kings of England remained the dukes of Normandy, and so were vassals of the Capetian king of France. And henceforth, the two great monarchies of Western Europe, England and France, were often at odds with each other and rivals over lands in central and northern France. Finally, the third monarchy is important for a variety of reasons, because this is what we would call the Holy Roman Empire, and this embraced Germany, parts of what are now eastern France, the Low Countries, the Alpine regions, northern and central Italy. This is a combination of the Old Middle Kingdom and the East Carolingian Kingdom that came out of the Treaty of Verdun in 843. These realms were united under Germanic kings, the most important of which is Otto I, of whom I've spoken in terms of his relationships with the Byzantines. And the monarchy in Germany also managed to gain control over the imperial title of those old lands of the Middle Kingdom, which required the King of Germany to go to Rome and get the papal coronation. Otto I symbolized this in 962 when he traveled to Rome and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the then reigning Pope. And henceforth, the kings of Germany were linked to northern and central Italy for this political reason. Furthermore, their domains in northern and central Italy were extremely lucrative and important to their position in Germany, as well as their various vassals in the Old Middle Kingdom, in what now would be the Rhineland, the Low Countries, and even parts of southeastern France. The Holy Roman Emperors, on the other hand, never succeeded in making their position hereditary. Ultimately, what happened in the 9th and 10th centuries is that, again, political authority broke down to the local level, but never to the extreme fragmentation you saw in what became France. There were 5 great dukedoms: Saxony, Franconia, Lorraine, or German Lotharingia, Swabia, and Bavaria. These dukes retained the power to elect the emperor. That's how Otto I became emperor of the king of the Germans, and then the Pope gave the coronation. And what evolved in the course of German history was a tension between the great electors who consolidated these dukedoms and would oppose, in some instances, the efforts of the king to superimpose his authority over his lands, and the royal authority that is always trying to make the claim hereditary. And ultimately, the hereditary claim in Germany fails. It always has this elective component going back to early Germanic history. Nonetheless, the electors or the elector dukes of Germany are important, again, in consolidating at the local level political and economic institutions. So when Urban II launched his First Crusade, he got his main response not from the great feudal kings, but rather from the great lords and nobility of the Holy Roman Empire and France. The English played very little in the First Crusade. And that was logical, because it was the feudal lords who, in effect, consolidated political power. It was they, over the last 150 years, had devised the traditions and refined the traditions of homage and vassalage, who had pioneered new techniques in warfare. It was they who reduced the brigand lords and the lesser knights and Castilians of their districts to their authority and brought back some sort of political and social order to Western Europe. And it was so logical that the nobility of France, the nobility of the western domains of the Holy Roman Empire would respond to the appeal of Urban II, whereas the kings were still in the first stages of constructing more effective monarchies, and in the case of, well, actually all three of them, they still essentially ruled their domains from horseback. They were committed to traveling, to exacting their feudal dues, to making their presence known, but ultimately their authority still depended very heavily on their nobility. And so those kings could not afford to leave their domains on crusade, whereas the nobles of Western Europe were in an ideal position to take up the call of Urban II.